Hi, I'm Karen Spencer, IAWP Certified Wellness Coach and Certified Mind-Body Eating Coach. Today, I want to share some thoughts about our relationship to food and specifically why it's important that we stop labeling food as good and bad. Now, you don't have to listen to many conversations or scroll through your news feed for too long before coming across someone labeling food as all good or all bad and telling you to do the same. Don't get me wrong, there will always be foods that agree with us and foods that don't agree with our own individual biochemistry. We all have to figure that out, and I encourage everyone to do just that. But learning what foods work for you and deciding to honor that, that's going to look and feel very different from following someone else's advice on what is good and bad and constantly labeling your own choices as either good or bad. Now, on the surface, putting these concrete labels on food doesn't seem like a big deal. In fact, many times we like it. It's on or off, it's yes or no. Our brains don't like nuance or this gray area that sits here in the middle. Especially if you come from many years of dieting, the rules feel safe and familiar. They give us guardrails to live by. If you spent a good part of your life on a diet, you may not completely trust yourself around food, and these labels give us a false sense of security and control. I think that's why we tend to hang on to them longer than we should. But if you are someone, but something you have to ask yourself, and frankly something I had to ask myself years ago, is continuing to label foods as good and bad, is that really working? Is it giving you the results that you want? Is it supporting your relationship with food or hurting your relationship with food? Now, before we go any further, I do feel like I need to point out that suggesting you get rid of these labels doesn't mean I'm saying that everyone can eat all the things all the time and there will be no consequences. I found that for some reason, anything less than very prescriptive advice on what to eat and how much to eat is sometimes interpreted that way. I am, however, suggesting that your relationship with food doesn't have to be defined by struggle. So if you are ready to find a way to nourish yourself and peacefully coexist with food, here are 3 reasons why you need to let go of the good versus bad labels attached to food. Now, the first reason is that these labels are constantly changing. Sometimes nutrition can seem like a ping pong match with constantly changing advice. Literally what was terrible for us just a few years ago is now exactly the thing we should put on our plate. I think there's different reasons for this conflicting advice. One reason is that modern nutrition science is still pretty young compared to other sciences. Some vitamins were discovered less than 100 years ago. I think most were discovered between 1912 and I think the late 40s. But compare that to other sciences that have been studied for centuries, and you realize that nutrition is still evolving. Now, another thing to realize about this conflicting advice is that there is a lot of nutritional advice out there that is based on observational studies instead of randomized controlled trials. Now, observational studies can identify interesting trends, but they do not necessarily prove cause and effect. I'm not saying to ignore information that's available to us. I can geek out all day long on nutritional studies. I think it's fascinating. But when you hear or read something is good or bad, be willing to dig into it a little bit more. What is that information based on? What type of study was done? Who funded the study? That alone can typically tell you a lot. Then be willing to take that information, experiment, and figure out if something agrees with you or not. The second reason to consider letting go of the labels is that attaching moral value to food can lead to shame and judgment of ourselves. Broccoli isn't angelic and chocolate isn't the root of all evil. They really are just broccoli and chocolate. Now, sure, there could be consequences of never ever touching a vegetable and deciding to exist purely on chocolate, but that's very different from attaching moral value to every single food choice that we make all day long. The problem with attaching moral value to food is that you're really only one step away from a judgment on yourself. So for some people, when they eat a food that's considered bad, they immediately have thoughts like, I am bad, I am weak, I messed up. And then somehow I messed up spirals into I always mess up. Now we're sitting in a terrible place that's not about the food at all. It's not even about this one instance. It becomes a blanket judgment on our character. And that leads to shame and guilt. And the problem with shame and guilt is that we can't shame and guilt ourselves into long-term transformation. Shame and guilt tend to lead to quick fixes, and those have a very high failure rate when it comes to long-term results. So caring for yourself in a way that allows some grace to figure out what works for you and what doesn't, that's what leads to long-term results. The other thing about shame and guilt is that they are uncomfortable emotions that for some people can lead to the urge to escape or numb out. And of course, guess what provides escape and numbing out for people? Yep, food. And then the cycle just continues. So if you want to get rid of the shame and guilt, you really have to get rid of the food labels. The third consequence of labeling food as either good or bad is you end up with a preconceived notion of whether a particular food is going to agree with you or not. When this happens, you are less likely to rely on your own body's wisdom. Our bodies will tell us if something works for us or not. We just have to be willing to listen. And when you already have a food fitting into a very specific category, you are less likely to be aware of what your own body is telling you. You really do have to remain open to figure out if something's working for you. I personally experienced this a few years ago. I started getting a specific kind of eczema on my hands, and I was convinced that the cause was a food that is commonly labeled as bad and should be avoided at all cost. Well, I avoided that food, and when the eczema did not totally clear up, I started eliminating other things on my pretty lengthy bad list. Turns out, after a lot, and I mean a lot of experimentation, my eczema actually has two main triggers. One is stress, which has nothing to do with food at all, and the other is a food that would show up on most people's healthy list, but my particular body doesn't like it. The point is, if I had been more open-minded on where to look, I probably would have found the cause sooner and saved myself a lot of agony. But I was so caught up in other people's idea of what is good and bad, I didn't allow myself the exploration that was needed to really find the root cause. So I hope that explains how putting an end to the constant labels attached to food will help all of us shift our relationship with food, which is going to turn out to be a much more enjoyable way to exist. It's going to lessen the frustration of still evolving nutritional advice. You'll be less likely to fall into patterns of shame and guilt, and you'll learn to listen to your own body. And if you figure out something doesn't work for you, you can of course choose to avoid it. I really encourage you to think about when you might still be labeling food as good and bad. Where could you open up to the possibility of letting go of some of that? What would that look and feel like? Really think about what other areas of your life might be impacted if you begin to shift your relationship with food like this. Thank you so much for watching, and if you know someone that could benefit from this message, please go ahead and share this video.